Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1066, and we are currently at the old church in Hysna. Look at that wonderful window. We will today bravely attack directly Heidegger for the first time. I earlier have been greatly discouraged to do such a thing, for the good reason I will come into. But being in the ontic mood is not a preparation for understanding Heidegger, it's an obstacle. But more about that. The one who's assisting me in this project is no other than Mark Rethel. And his book Approaching Heidegger, written together with Max Murphy. An overview of being in time. And this is my first tryout at understanding being in time directly. And I also venture into trying to understand why approaching it directly is impossible. And this also serve a twofold property, an advance. And that advance is, first, we can understand why we cannot reach into Heidegger directly, but we can also understand his specific way of going about understanding being. Otherwise, we will try to understand being directly. And I think that will be disallowed. Sorry, it's a bit. Can you see here? Well, let me start with it. An overview of being in time. Mark A. Rethel and Max Murphy. In Being in Time, Heidegger aims to work out concretely the question concerning the sense of being. The published version of the book contains roughly 1/3 of the book Heidegger envisioned. And we have only rather sparse and sketchy indications of how the book would have looked when complete. It was to consist of 2 parts, with each part divided into 3 divisions. Part 1 was to offer an explication of time as the transcendental horizon for the question of being. The published portion of Being in Time consists of the first 2 divisions of Part 1, the preparatory sections of this project. Rather than offering an account of the sense of being in general, this divisions focus on a determinate entity, that is Dasein, the kind of entity which in his case we human beings are. Thus, Being in Time as it exists provides a very rich preparatory analysis of human being in the world. That's division 1, and then argues that our way of being has its sense in temporality, in division 2. Division 3, as envisaged, would have moved from the focus on Dasein toward an account of temporality as the horizon for understanding and interpreting the sense of being in general. Part 2 would have used the provisional account of temporality to destroy the history of ontology, focusing on Kant division 1, Descartes division 2, Aristotle Division 3. This is the destruction. Part 2, Heidegger claimed, would have shown concretely how traditional ontology was consistently grounded in experience of the temporal and historical structures of human existence. But the intention was to destroy or break down the categories of the ontological tradition which Heidegger claimed concealed the original experience of time. Neither Division 3 or Part 1 nor Part 2 were ever completed. Introduction. Inquiries into beings are often dismissed as superfluous or empty, because being is thought to be both so fundamental as to defy definition, and yet as well understood by everybody. Heidegger agrees, in fact, that being cannot be defined in the way that concepts about entities are, by deriving them from more basic concepts, or refining them by comparing them and contrasting them to other related well-defined concepts. And yet, Heidegger points out that it is the philosopher's task to illuminate the meaning of supposedly self-evident concepts. After all, the mere appeal to what is well understood without any further illumination often conceals a superficial and mistaken grasp of the matter. But if we're not asking for definition of being, what is the question of being after all? We make progress in understanding what being is, Heidegger argues, by getting clearing about the meaning or sense, Sinn, of being. The way Heidegger uses the term sense is akin to the way we say in English that something makes sense. Things make sense when they fit together, when there is an organized, stable, and coherent way in which they interact and bear on us and each other. We grasp the sense of something when we know our way around it. We can anticipate what kind of things can happen with respect to it. We recognize when things belong or are out of place, and so on. This is what Heidegger means when he says that sense is that within which intelligibly of something maintains itself. Sense is that onto which projection projects, in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. Sense is background way of organizing and fitting things together, which guides and shapes all our anticipation of interactions with the things we encounter. So Heidegger has found a back way into understanding, and he's using Sinn to get to it, instead of approaching the subject head-on, which will leave him still in the ontic state. This latter way of approaching that modus is the standard modus of all learning today. This is not what Heidegger is pointing to. So we can gain a twofold thing. First, we can learn about Heidegger, but the second thing is that we can also understand what he means about modus. Understanding itself, not the content of an understanding, but the understanding modus, and that there are different modus. Ordinary learning never looks at modus. That has never ever happened until Heidegger. Well, that's at least what Heidegger himself claims. I seem to agree. And this is a new thing. And having the idea that Heidegger's writing, Being and Time, is of the character of content of understanding is absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. And that's the reason why we're often advised not to attack or trying to understand Being and Time head on, directly. It's not a good idea. because what you already know will hinder you in this case. It will not further the understanding. Heidegger is very explicit about this. What he wants to teach us, it's not a new content of understanding, is rather that there are different kinds of understanding. And he doesn't propose one over the other. It's just saying that there are different ways of understanding, and this is a new way. In ordinary thinking, we just have education books and so forth. There's no talk about a modus anywhere. And I would say, bar a very few understanders and interpreters of Heidegger, none of them understand modus. The reason being that they come from an ontic tradition. An ontic tradition that is today much more firmly established than it was at the time of the publication of Being in Time. We explain the sense, I continue here, the sense of being when we can point out, illuminate what we understand when we know our way around entities as entities, meaning that we are able to distinguish between what is not, or between how something is and how is not. The conceptual apparatus that must be brought to bear in explaining this sense, however, is anything but clear. Heidegger largely dispenses with traditional ontological categories. Listen to this. He dispenses with traditional ontological categories and tries to develop his own ontological concept by interrogating entities with regard to their being, viewing them in the context of their being rather than, for instance, in the context of the causal interactions with each other. Towards this ends, Heidegger proposes that the inquiry should focus from the outside on a particular entity, one that is well suited for interrogation with respect to its being. Dasein has priority for the inquiry because it gets its essential character from what is inquired about, namely being, in the sense that we are defined as an entity by our possession of an understanding of being. We relate to being in the sense that we understand that there are different ways to be, and thus we are capable of deciding our existence. End of quote. Dasein has priority in another way as well. It not only understands its own existence, but it also possesses an understanding of the being of all entities of character other than its own. If we examine another entity with regard to its being, for instance a physical object like a stone, we hope only for insight into its particular mode of being. But Dasein's dealing with an entity show a sensitivity to different ways of being. Thus, by analyzing Dasein's different modes of comportment, we can hope to gain insight to a number of modes of being. Heidegger offers two rather concise arguments meant to motivate the question of being, as well to further clarify its function and aim. The question of being, Heidegger argues, has priority over all other scientific inquiries, because every science works with a prior ontological understanding of its subject matter. Listen now, this is very important. The natural sciences, for instance, have a certain pre-theoretical understanding of what it is to be a natural entity, as opposed to a cultural or historical entity. Behind the basic concepts of any positive science, Heidegger thus argues that there is a tacit ontology, a productive logic which discloses an area of being and guides scientific inquiry within that domain. Without an explicitly and thematically developed ontology, Heidegger argues, there is danger that the science will be led astray by unfounded metaphysical assumptions. Well, my commentary is we don't have a reach into the why question. And if we don't have reach into the why question, all other questions are being more or less dependent on something we don't know about. Let me continue here. The other motivation for asking the question of being is rooting in our essence as Dasein. The question of existence is one of Dasein's ontological affairs. We care about our being, that is, about the ways in which we have decided and will decide our existence. But it might turn out that having a clear-sighted understanding of being gives us a guidance on how we ought to take a stand on our being. But how is the question to be pursued? What method is to be employed? We already have a certain understanding of being. We have a sense for the difference between being and non-being, and we grasp pre-reflectively, though imperfectly, what it is to be a human being, as opposed to rock, as opposed to be to a number, and so on. Since the focus will be on our kind of being, the initial task is to illuminate Dasein as it shows up in our pre-reflective understanding, Dasein in its everydayness. This will be done by offering a description in which essential structures will be exhibited, which persist as determinative of being in every kind of being of factical Dasein. Heidegger calls this method of description and exhibits essential structures phenomenology, since it involves interpreting or layering out what we already tacitly understand. It is a hermeneutic phenomenology. Finding the right concepts to describe the structure of everyday Dasein, concepts that will let Dasein show itself in its being, is the task of Division 1. But this will yield at best a provisional account of Dasein, since it won't show us why it makes sense that those structures are determinative of the being of Dasein. Thus, this preparatory analytic of Dasein will have to be repeated on a higher and authentically ontological basis, in which we uncover and articulate the sense of being. That is, once we establish the first pathway to being, we will have to articulate the question once more, but now in a language and a question base that is founded on the very nature of being, not on beings or the content of beings. This is the task of Division 2. The answer to the question of the sense of being of Dasein is temporality. It is temporality against the background of which the essential structures of Dasein are intelligible, as determining the being of Dasein. Let's go into Division 1, and I want to add one of the footnotes here from Mark Brethel. It is helpful to distinguish between 1, the pre-reflective understanding of being that is embodied, at least in part, by all Dasein in their everyday dealings with the world. 2, the pre-theoretical understanding of being, alluded to above, that as scientific theory presupposes as applying to its particular domain of entities. And 3, a pre-ontological understanding of being that we have prior to making being our explicit theme in ontology. Heidegger begins Division 1 by giving a brief sketch of what Dasein is and how it differs from all other types of entities. The central claim, once again, is that Dasein is the one kind of entity which has an understanding of being. This does not mean that all human beings explicitly know the meaning of being, for in such a case everyone would be already in the possession of a fundamental ontology, and Heidegger's project would be superfluous. Well, a commentary on that. If it would be possible for us to directly understand being in time without doing this fundamental questioning of Dasein, or the beings, the whole project would be superfluous. It would not be a philosophical work at all. It would be even lower than other philosophical work, because it does not establish anything. Since all other philosophies establishing something, being in time doesn't establish anything, zero. But it points to certain things. It points to modality. And modality in itself is not an existence, although it produces existence, which is quite different. Rather, Dasein's understanding of being is for the most part implicit and vague, pre-ontological in the sense of lacking an explicit ontology. The philosophical development of this pre-ontological understanding will often require correcting what we think we understand about being. Traditional ontology, Heidegger claims, has misconstrued our being as human beings by assuming that we share the same mode of being as other entities we encounter within the world, such as tables, rocks, churches, dogs, atoms, or numbers. From Aristotle to Descartes and beyond, for instance, both human beings and non-human things were understood to be alike in that they were substances, discretely individuated, self-sufficient entities that possesses determinate properties and stand in contingent external relations to one another. Although different substances possess different determinative or essential properties, traditional ontology applies the same ontological categories applied to all of them. Heidegger argues, however, that our pre-reflective ways of distinguishing the different types of entities is grounded in an ontological difference. Much of Division 1 is concerned with articulating these ontological distinctions. And here's a commentary on my side here. Believing that a modus is a mental mode is wrong. And that is the mistake we usually do when we think about understanding as being within somehow, being in my head or something similar. That's a grave mistake. And this is one of those things that Heidegger most definitely is challenging. And modus is both outer world and inner world at the same time. This is how beings come into presence. Otherwise there would be no beings at all. Chapter 1. As an initial specification of Dasein, Heidegger observes, we are ourselves the entities to be analyzed. The being of any such entity is in each case mine. These entities in their being comport themselves toward their being. Being is that which is an issue for every such entity. What does it mean to say that being is an issue for Dasein? When I say that something is an issue for me, I mean that it matters to me, that it has importance or significance for me, or that I care about it. It also implies that there is something I can do about it, that its condition can be altered or affected by me. Many of Heidegger's main points are foreshadowed by this claim, that the world is to be understood as a contingent structure of significance, that entities in the world and our activities are understood on the basis of their sense, and that the being of Dasein is care. Because Dasein can comport itself towards its being, it differs fundamentally from all other entities. Heidegger uses the term existence to refer to Dasein's mode of being. He calls the modes of being for entities other than Dasein presence at hand, or occurrentness, Vorhandenheit, and readiness to hand, availableness, Zuhandenheit. As the name suggests, available entities are entities that offer us ready, intelligible modes of use. Most of the things we encounter in everyday life are available. We are familiar with them, and they afford or solicit actions from us in response. Heidegger addresses availableness in detail in chapter 3. Occurrent entities, by contrast, are the entities we discover when we abstract from our practical engagement with the world and take up a reflective or theoretical or scientific attitude towards it. Then we find entities which are defined not by the roles they play in our world, but by their inherent physical properties. Heidegger argues that traditional ontology has focused on occurrentness and erroneously attempted to interpret all entities as occurrent. Let me repeat that because it's quite important. Heidegger argues that traditional ontology has focused on occurrentness and erroneously attempted to interpret all entities as occurrent. But because being is an issue for Dasein, it resists being explained as just one type of occurrent entity among others. In the history of philosophy, a number of different accounts have been offered regarding our essence as human beings. According to Aristotle, the essence of a human being is to be a rational animal. For Christian philosophers, the essence of a human being is to be created in the image of God. In the Cartesian paradigm, the essence of a human being is to be a conscious subject with the capacity to reflect on its mental representations. The implicit assumption behind each of these definitions of the essence of humanity is that human beings are ontologically homogeneous with all other entities, differing only in virtue of possessing different essential properties. When you think about it, it's rather horrid. We are different from lower animals, for instance, either because we are essentially rational, or because they were created by God for us, or because they are incapable of reflecting on their representations. On this traditional view, the history of different interpretations of humanity's essence can be understood as an argument over which of the properties we possess is really the essential one. Heidegger, however, takes this history as a sign that Dasein has an ontology fundamentally different from other entities. Namely, Dasein is an entity which interprets its own essence. Comment here. Think about the Klein bottle, how it goes into itself. Interpenetration. Its essence is not found in the possession of this or that property. Its essence is found in its lack of essential property in the traditional sense. If existence names our mode of being, and we are entities for whom we are being an issue, then it follows, as Heidegger's family proclaims, that the essence of Dasein lies in its existence. Another way of putting this would be to say that Dasein's essence is open. It's never fixed once and for all, and each of us is capable of reinterpreting ourselves. This is what Heidegger means when he says that the being of any such entity is in each case mine. But it's also important, Heidegger thinks, that we inherit our possibilities from the particular shared social world we live in. The next chapter elaborates on our being in the world as the fundamental structure of Dasein. Chapter 2. As existing self-interpreting entities, we stand in an essential relationship to the world. Heidegger calls our basic state being in the world, and hyphenates the terms to emphasize it is a unitary phenomenon that can only be understood when seen as a whole. Dasein and the world are fundamentally misunderstood if taken as two self-sufficient entities that can subsequently enter into an external relationship. Comment for this is Dasein do not equal me self-consciousness. Neither does Dasein equals the objects. It is both in a pre-ontological way. Rather, we are entities which necessarily find ourselves in an embodied state, dealing with a world which, for its part, is prior to any particular individual, but essentially a meaningful structure, and thus only exists for entities like us who are capable of grasping meanings. Even though Heidegger focuses on each element of being in the world separately, the world component in chapter 3, the who of Dasein in chapter 4, and the being in relation in chapter 5. He insists that we keep in mind that these components are abstractions from the overall unitary phenomenon. So the who and the being in, and what we find as the world, are all unitary concepts, but on an abstracted level, in order for us to reach a foundation where we can ask the next question. Very important. If you start without going to that foundation, if you go directly from reading other philosophers, other books, you will re-establish the ontic mode, and Heidegger will never ever be reached. My comment here. This chapter offers a preliminary sketch of being in the world, one which aims in particular to fend off our tendency to import occurrentist assumptions into ontology. For instance, if one takes Dasein as just another occurrent entity, its being in tends to be understood on the model of spatial containment. When we say that someone is in the world, however, we primarily mean that he or she is at home or familiar with a certain way of living, or residing in a particular way of organizing entities, activities, aims, ideals, and so on. This relationship of being at home in the world is poorly modeled in terms of spatial containment. Comment here. So grand, it actually parallels perfectly with the previous lecture. Remember the receptacle of Aristotle, the receptacle for all existences, beings. the space around it. We also, in the ontic mood, have a space around us. This is what is being put in under interrogation here. Not criticism, very important as well, but interrogation. Of course, we do bear a physical relationship to objects around us. We are constrained by particular features of the environment we find ourselves in, as it bears on the particular features of us as embodied beings. Our traits, dispositions, skills, and so on. Heidegger calls such features our facticity. And remember, for instance, if you say that all mental structures come from the head or from the inner, from the brain, like sort of compare that to radio that receives something. And of course, without the radio, or the radio turned off, or the volume too low, you won't hear anything. But to say that the program is coming out of the radio, that is just wrong. And this wrongness is always done within academia today. I never ever heard any exception from that rule, and also from the church. No exception. Otherwise, I would say that Hedenius, who once wrote a really powerful book here in Sweden, would have been sort of put to his final rest directly, or before even being printed. But that interrogation was never made. Criticism, however, which worsened the case, were made. And I think this points to the importance of being in time. It is not something to be it's a facticity that the modus seem to come out of the head. But it's not the only factor. It's a twofold way. As well as me seeing tombstones around me here at the churchyard, me not being here would take away the tombstones as well. Me seeing the tombstones and the tombstones seeing me is the modus. I call that the four-focal setting. And it's very important here, once more, to understand Dasein never ever equals an entity like me, my brain, my consciousness, or anything similar to that. I think that it could be questioned another way, because if you do some sort of an infinite regress, you start saying that my entity is actually made of the entity I'm looking at, the objective entity, the materiality, for instance, as a sort of a facticity. You will end into trouble. You start saying my consciousness is my materiality, and you might end up with saying I don't exist or anything like that. And I would say that shows not to be working. You're more than welcome to accept that. I don't. Carry on. Being factually dispersed into definite ways of being in is different than being in determinate spatial and causal relationship to occurrent entities in our proximity. The entities within the world that Dasein encounters are, for the most part, the things it deals with in conducting its life. Hammers, nails, pencils, papers, tables, chairs, door stairs, cars, cloths, food, air, the ground, the sky, and so on. We make use of those entities in various ways in our pursuit of our purposes and projects. They show up not as objects with properties, very important, but rather as the functional role they play in these projects. In Heidegger's terms, the being of these entities is to be available, to afford or solicit particular ways of engaging them. We can encounter them When we have concern, besorgen for them, we possess embodied competence for handling them, and it matters to us how they interact with each other and with us. Concern for available entities is one of our fundamental ways of being in the world. Let me give an example directly here. The tombstones I see here, I could, like well, it takes Hume or Kant, say that I know them. I know their properties, I can define them, I can see shape, length, and so forth. Heidegger would not agree. I can only know them by doing them. I can't make a tombstone, therefore they are not so handen to me. I don't know their properties, I don't know their objects. You see? Whereas my grandfather, he would know these tombstones. It could even be the case that he made some of these tombstones. He was actually a tombstone cutter in this area. But I guess he would have been too young. Well, anyway, we are in the world then, primarily by way of understanding it, by knowing our way about it in it. In the preliminary sketch of being in the world, Heidegger is also concerned to fend off the tendency to think of our understanding on the model of cognition of the occurrent world. Among the ways in which we concern ourselves with entities are those specialized projects of the modern developed world known as the sciences. Science in the broadest sense consists in the construction of theoretical representations of nature, which allow us to predict and explain empirical phenomena, to manipulate natural forces, and to produce technological artifacts. All such projects share a common feature. They are ways of understanding entities in the world, as well of the world itself, in purely occurrent terms. And here we see a problem with theoretical knowledge. It could be infused by an understanding, and it could also be completely shallow, dependent whether if you encountered the things or the things at hand. And I think that somewhere on the line we hollowed out our knowledge and we ended up with a knowledge that is not knowledge. It is not infused with knowing. And me, for instance, to be quite honest, I can't make a difference between maybe something I can understand, like how to drive my car here, and how a tombstone is. They're both objects to me. And thereby I'm nullifying even the knowledge I have. And I will not be more skilled. I'll be used to not knowing anything. I'll be using the same measure for everything, so to speak. I think that's not a term that Heidegger would agree on, but maybe it's a pointer. How do we get to all the concepts? There's nothing wrong with concepts. We need concepts, but they have been hollowed out. Because we don't do the doing anymore. We cannot differentiate between things we know and things we don't know. Therefore, we know nothing, we assume. And that not knowing is the ontic structure. Theoretical understanding abstracts from our everyday dealings with available entities and the significance things usually have for us in order to arrive at a representation of the universe as an occurrent totality, which is causally determined throughout and amenable to exhaustive mathematical representation. And yet, for all the power and utility of knowing the world through these theoretical representations, it is a form of understanding that, from the standpoint of fundamental ontology, is derivative from our everyday concern, most important. Once we start my commentary, once we starting to understand our everyday dealings with the things, we can largen our understanding, and no longer our concepts will be that hollow. It is an invitation to understand the world, so to speak. The why question is therefore that important, because it also leads to the what, where, when question. This chapter offers an account for the world and entities within the world as we encounter them in everyday life. We must not think of the world as simply the extended physical universe. Instead, Heidegger uses world to point to the whole, the unified totality of entities tied together by a complex network of significant relationships. To think of the world as a mere universe, a collection of that is to assume an occurrentist ontology. Heidegger's name for the entities that we encounter proximally and for the most part is equipment, Psych. The clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the doors we open, the ground on which we walk, the pens with which we write, the signs we read, understand and follow, these are all primarily show themselves as available. To see this, imagine what it would involve to understand these entities as occurrent substances with occurrent properties. One could attempt to give an exhaustive description of a pen, for instance, in the language of theoretical physics. This description would involve measurable quantities such as the mass and volume of the pen, an algebraic equation that describes the approximate shape of the pen, and its positional properties such as the mechanical forces which would be exerted when the cap is removed or the button is pressed. But in normal circumstances, when we are using the pen and it's functioning well, none of these properties show up in our experience. And we found ourselves absorbed, aufgehend, in what we are writing. The pen itself is for the most part transparent or inconspicuous. However, in abnormal circumstances, some of the physical properties, for instance shape, size, mass, forces of the pen, become conspicuous or obtrude. In certain way, the mass of the pen shows up when it's too heavy or too light. The shape of the pen shows up when it makes holding the pen uncomfortable. The internal forces of the pen show up when the cap is difficult to remove. But even in these cases, the pen is still not a merely occurrent substance. Instead, it has a deficient mode of being that Heidegger calls unavailableness. All the relevant parameters here are purpose relative and thus not reducible to occurrent properties. It would be vain to seek general criteria in Dasein independent terms, of course. For what counts as too heavy, uncomfortable or difficult? Moreover, the way in which one deals with a pen that is functioned poorly is not to take note of its occurrent properties, but simply to toss it aside and find the closest replacement. I think that is a good time to end. It's tough enough, but please remember Heidegger is a new journey and it's nothing akin to anything else you ever encountered. We first need to make a new foundation, and then we go into the second level inquiry mode from a new and fresh start. But if we let the old establishment, the old thinking be still active, we will strand somewhere within the old realm. And this is exactly what Heidegger wants to avoid. That's his whole purpose. Well, I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.